And our son came home recently from school, and he was very excited to show us something, something that he'd learned at school. The school chaplain had come in and taught everyone a trick with their hands, and he came home saying, "Mummy, Daddy, look at this." He said, "Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors, and here's the people." Exactly. And at the heart of church is the people. And today we are wrapping up our series in Nehemiah, and the passage we're looking at is all about the people. See, they had been doing this building work, rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem. But really, God was doing a building work in them. And they were seeing restoration come out of the rubble, finishing the walls, even through challenge and opposition, not willing to give up, as Jen shared with us last week. And now the walls are finished. They are complete, but God's building work in them is far from being finished. They still needed to be renewed and the community reformed. With much of the city of Jerusalem taking shape, with the walls and temple being rebuilt, they might have slipped into thinking that's all that God wanted. And was like, hey, job done. We've done our job. The walls are looking good. The temple's looking good. We've moved home. Job done. They might have felt like they'd made it. Even though the walls and the temple were there, they could have been seen as a monument to God. But God's purpose in this building work wasn't about building a monument to God. It was about becoming a movement for God. A movement of people radically changed, transformed, and dependent on Him so that they could bring His blessing to the world. The point is this: God is wanting a movement, not a monument. God's in the people business, not in the monument-making business. And God has that same purpose for us here today. God's purpose for the church was never for it to be a monument, to be admired, but for it to be a movement of people whose lives had been utterly and radically changed by Jesus. So we, in turn, can be that same blessing to the world. So we're wrapping up this series in Nehemiah by looking at chapter 8 today. And it's a really long chapter. I was going to read all of it, but I thought instead what I'll do is I'll briefly summarize the first half of it, and then the second half will be on screen. So the first half of this chapter, the walls are finished, but their community life still needs an awful lot of work. And in comes a man named Ezra. Ezra, like Nehemiah, had been working as a Persian state official and had come to Jerusalem to reorganize what was going on amongst the people. He came to teach God's law, bring fresh vision for how the people were to live within the walls. So he brought out what we think today might be the Torah, which is God's law, as found in the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. This is what he brought to the people. They built him a makeshift high wooden platform, in other words, a pulpit, especially for this occasion. And people gathered to listen to Ezra speaking the word, speaking God's law. He spoke from daybreak until noon, so 6 hours he spoke for, whilst everyone stood to listen. They were standing the whole time. They weren't sitting on squeaky chairs. They were standing the whole time. What a long sermon. If you think, 25 minutes is long, imagine standing there for 6 hours and listening to this spoken word. Now, the law was actually written in the Hebrew language. However, time had passed. Since time had passed in exile, the next generation of people in Jerusalem now spoke Aramaic. They spoke a different language. Aramaic was the language of the empire. So they did not understand the law spoken in Hebrew. So what had to happen was a group of Levites had to translate so everyone could understand. And the people were so challenged they were cut to the core by what they heard, and they began weeping as they realized how far short they had fallen from God's law. But Nehemiah, Ezra, and those translating told the people not to weep. And instead they were to go away and feast, because this was meant to be a joyful day. So where we pick up in Nehemiah, it's the next day. So they've gone home, they've feasted, and the next day everyone has gathered back together again in the assembly, and that's where we're picking up. So Nehemiah chapter 8 from verse 13. If you want to have a physical Bible in your hands, feel free to grab one from the back or flick on your phone, and also we have it on the screen. So a myriad of options. So Nehemiah chapter 8 from verse 13. On the second day of the month, the heads of all the families, along with the priests and the Levites, gathered around Ezra the teacher to give attention to the words of the law. They found written in the law, which the Lord had commanded through Moses, that the Israelites were to live in temporary shelters during the festival of the 7th month, and that they should proclaim this word and spread it throughout their towns and in Jerusalem. Go out into the hill country and bring back branches from olive and wild olive trees, and from myrtles, palms and shade trees to make temporary shelters, as it is written. So the people went out and brought back branches and built themselves temporary shelters on their own roofs, in their courtyards, in the courts of the house of God, and in the square by the water gate, and the one by the gate of Ephraim. The whole company that had returned from exile built temporary shelters and lived in them. From the days of Joshua, son of Nun, until that day, the Israelites had not celebrated like this, and their joy was very great. Day after day, from the first day to the last, Ezra read from the book of the law of God. They celebrated the festival for 7 days, and on the 8th day, in accordance with the regulation, there was an assembly. So picture that scene. The walls and the temple were finished. Many people had new homes and had returned to Jerusalem, having been away in exile. And what did they do? They went for a week camping in their backyard. How strange. What on earth were they doing? What were they thinking? Well, before and after exile, there were 3 main Jewish festivals celebrated every year where people would make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. In spring, there was the Passover festival, where they remembered and celebrated how God saved his people from slavery in Egypt. Then there was the Pentecost festival, 50 days later, also known as the Feast of Weeks, celebrating the giving of the 10 Commandments of Mount Sinai. And then in autumn, there's this third festival, the Festival of Tabernacles, or the Festival of Tents. And Jesus redefined and gave new meaning to each of these 3 festivals. The Passover, he became the lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood was shed for the forgiveness of many. Pentecost festival, he redefined in the giving of the Holy Spirit. And then this third festival that we're looking at today, the Festival of Tabernacles, we're going to see in John's Gospel how Jesus redefined and gave new meaning to this festival that we're seeing in Nehemiah chapter 8. You see, they really knew how to feast and celebrate together. However, this got lost whilst they were in exile. They were not celebrating these festivals as they had been before. And this festival that we read of in this chapter was a celebration lasting 8 days, and they rediscovered this through Ezra reading God's law. And this festival has 3 key elements that were to serve as an annual reminder of their identity, their DNA as a movement. These three things were tents, water, and light. And we're going to look at each of these three things and what they mean to us today. And I even have visual illustrations for all those three things. Can I get a ooh? I've been working hard this week. What's that? They will be. They will be in a moment. Patience. So, firstly, tents. So for most of the year, I love sleeping in a comfy bed and having a warm shower. But it gets to this time of year, and I start to long to be out in a tent and go camping. And we haven't been properly camping out in the wild since pre-kids, but we have been camping in our back garden for a bit of fun. And I love that feeling of sleeping outside, free from possessions and technology. And it's a great reset moment for me and helps me put things into perspective. This is what we see in Nehemiah chapter 8. Picture the scene. What a sight it must have been as this new generation celebrated this festival for the first time after rebuilding Jerusalem. So they went out, they collected materials, they collected branches, leaves from trees to make these temporary shelters. They made these makeshift booths, these shelters on every flat top roof, in every part of the city, in the courtyards, even in the house of God, in the temple courtyard. Ezra did this, Nehemiah did this, the priests, everyone. And for 7 days, no one ate or slept in their own home. The entire population lived in these temporary shelters and celebrated together. So I've got a wee tent here. Can I have a volunteer? Come on. Jen, well done. Can you pull this out? It is pop-up, so it might whack you in the face, so just be careful. There we go. Okay. So I don't think it would have quite been like this. It probably would have taken a bit longer, but the whole nation slept, ate, did life for 7 days in these temporary shelters. Why would they do this? Why would God want the whole nation at the same time to do this? Well, the whole festival was a reenactment of the years God's people were in the desert, in the wilderness, after God freed them from slavery in Egypt. They did not know how long they were going to be in the desert for. They did not know when God would move them on to another location as a step closer to the promised land. So they remained in temporary, movable shelters. For 40 years they did this. 40 years in the desert, whilst God led them closer to the promised land. And in that time, God looked after them. He provided for them. He gave them manna from heaven, food to eat every single day as they traveled and lived in these temporary shelters. God took care of them all the way. In the wilderness, they couldn't have sturdy, permanent structures. They had to be able to pack up and move on. And they had to depend on God. So this festival was a reminder to them that right in their DNA was not an immovable establishment. It wasn't a monument built of bricks and stone, but a movement of God's people trusting in Him, following Him, dependent on Him for their existence. And the length, 7 days they were in these shelters, in these tents, was a representation of 70 years for this festival, someone's whole lifespan. So the essence of this festival of tabernacles is that living in dependence on God and His provision is not just for a season, but it's for a whole lifetime. It's for a whole lifetime. And this is what God is saying to each of us today. As a church, we don't want to be creating a monument here. However nice it might look, where we can sit back and say, hey, we've got a church. Let's settle down. Tick, job done. We need to be in the posture of living in tents, dependent on God to provide, ready to follow him. So that's the first element of the Festival of Tabernacles that we see in this passage. The second and the third element, we're actually going to jump forward to John's Gospel when the people of that time were celebrating this same festival, the Festival of Tabernacles. So the second element, I'm just going to move this along a bit, is water. So last summer I had a day booked in to go and do some hill walking. It's another thing I love to do. I love to get out in the hills, and it was a roasting hot day, and I hadn't yet reached the top of this hill when I ran out of water. It was a disaster. It was absolutely sweltering. I was so thirsty for water, and I literally had several hours to go before I'd actually make it back to the car where I had more water. There were several full summits along the way, so I'd get to a point thinking, there's the top, and I'd get to it, and there'd be another bit of the hill. I'd be like, oh no, and I was going further and further. I was thinking, I'm going to have to turn back. I'm so thirsty. But I made it to the top, and then I got back down, all the way back to the car as quick as possible. I raced down, and I was so dehydrated, I just guzzled down all this water at the car, and I ended up feeling really ill for the rest of the day. I think some of us might have been moaning recently about the hot weather that we've had here in Inverclyde, but that's nothing compared to the heat of a desert. Whilst God's people were in the wilderness, they were in desperate need of water, and God provided it for them. Moses struck a rock whilst they were desperate, and water came gushing out. God provided enough for all of them to drink. And to represent this, during the Feast of Tabernacles, for the first 7 days, the high priest would take a container and he'd walk to the pool of Siloam, which was just within the walls of Jerusalem, and he would fill the container with water. It's a second illustration. He'd fill it with water. I've got another couple of bits here. Okay, there we go. So he'd fill it with water. And what he'd do is he'd go back to the temple, and he would literally pour the water on the altar. Can I have another volunteer who's got a good pour? Go on, Kirsty. There we go. Do you want to pour it into the bowl? All of it, as long as it doesn't overflow. I was going to just pour it straight on the table, but I thought that would be a bit of a mess, wouldn't it, today? Amazing. Thank you, Kirsty. So pour the water on the altar, and it would flood out. And he'd do this every day for the first 7 days of the festival. He'd go to the pool of Siloam, he'd fill up the container, he'd go back to the temple, and he'd pour it on the altar. Every single day, he'd do this journey. And it was to remind the people that if God had not provided water for them in the desert, they would not have survived. God provided for when they were thirsty. They were so thirsty they could have died of thirst. But God provided water. So they had this visual illustration on the first 7 days, every day, out to the pool, pouring water on the altar. Second day, out to the pool, pouring water on the altar. And it goes on. Then on the 8th day, in John's Gospel, at the climax of the festival, anticipation had been building for all 7 days, Jesus appears on the scene. And in John chapter 7, Aidan, these verses should be on the laptop. John chapter 7. Verse 37, thank you, my friend. It says this: on the last and greatest day of the festival, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from them." By this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. Isn't that incredible? 7 days, water poured on the altar. Jesus rocks up and says, "Sack that, come to me. I am your living water. If you are thirsty, anyone, come to me." And if you read on, it causes a bit of a scene, and people do not like this because they understood what Jesus was saying here and how radical it was of what Jesus was claiming. What a promise. Jesus was saying, remember the old days when you were thirsty and water came out of a rock and saved you and saved your ancestors? Well, a new day has come. I am the living water. Are you thirsty? Come to me. Believe in me. I will be to you what the water from the rock in the desert was to your ancestors. A life source, a never-ending life source. And as the high priest would draw water from the pool, he would recite a verse from Isaiah chapter 12, verse 3, which says, "With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation." The word for salvation in the Hebrew language is Yeshua, which is the Hebrew name for Jesus. Yeshua, our salvation. So today we could read that verse as, with joy you will draw water from the wells of Jesus. It's all about Jesus. He is our living water. He is our life source. Jesus, Yeshua, says, "Come to me and drink." He is our salvation. He is our life source. Like water flowing from a rock in the desert, he is life to us. Without him, we would not be here. And the tragedy as Christians is when we think we can do things in our own strength. When we stop longing for him. Imagine being in a desert and not longing and thirsting for water. You'd be crazy. Yet that's a tragedy as Christians, when we stop longing and thirsting for Jesus, when we think we can get along fine as we are. Jesus wants us to long for him like he longs for us. So he says, "Come and drink. If you're thirsty, come to me and I will give you living water." And if we take a drink from him, he says that the Holy Spirit, out of our innermost being, streams of living water will come. I'm thirsty for his presence. I'm still thirsty for Jesus. Perhaps you're in a desert place today, feeling dry and thirsty, and he says to you today, "Come, my friends, come. Be filled again." Water flowing within and without. We need to be thirsty for him and go to him again and again and again. We have the tent, we have the water, and the final key element of this festival was light. And with this, I'm coming into land. So my dad told me that when he was younger, at his Christian youth group, they had this activity that they'd do when the youth leaders would drive into the middle of nowhere, drop the youth group off in pitch black in darkness in the middle of the night with just a map and a compass and then leave them and drive off. And they'd have to find their way all the way back to their youth centre, to their camp area, by themselves. No phones, no leaders, in the middle of the night. I mean, can you imagine that happening now? And the PVGs, the risk assessments, the health and safety, a group of kids just being dumped in the middle of nowhere. And my dad would recall the relief when finally, after what seemed like hours and hours, they'd see the lights of where they were heading. Well, on the first day of this feast, 4 huge candlesticks were lit. Each of these had 7 lamps. And like the shelters and the water, the lights were to remind the people of being in the desert and how for 40 years God led them by the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. It was a visual representation. And I've not got 7 candlesticks, but I do have 1 wee tea light. So, could I have one final volunteer? Gavin, I'm looking at you. Here we go. If you can light that, that would be great. So do you want me to kind of hold this? Oh, is this going to work? Is that it? Brilliant. Thank you. Good job. Day 1 of the festival, they lit these candles and they burned throughout the whole time. Shortly after Jesus had said, controversially, hey, you see this water? Come to me. I'm the one you really need. I'm your life source. Shortly after that, at the end of the festival, when all the lights were being put out, they were all being extinguished. In John chapter 8, verse 12, what does Jesus say? I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Isn't that amazing? As the lights were being put out, Jesus said, hey, just like the water, I've got another trick up my sleeve for you. I'm the light as well. Surprise! He's the light of the world. Jesus declared to everyone that just like God's fire in the desert, guiding the people for 40 years, without which they wouldn't have had a clue which way to go, where to go, what to do. Jesus is our light. He is our guide, and we no longer need to walk in darkness. We're on this kingdom building adventure as a church family. He's bringing something beautiful out of the rubble in our midst, in our lives. He is restoring and renewing. And these 3 symbols, elements, whatever you want to call them, are vital for this church family today. The tent, because he is our provider and we can trust in him. The water, he is our life source. This church is nothing without Jesus. This church is nothing without his Spirit flowing in us and out of us. And we must drink from him. And the light, because he is our guide and we must follow his light. Let's never settle for a monument. Let's live in dependence on him, and from this place will flow streams of living water.